The treasure no one understood. Deep within the jagged cliffs of the Ashen Mountains, where the wind never truly rested and storms carved their names into stone, there existed a place few creatures dared to approach. The mountains rose like broken teeth against the sky, dark, ancient, and unforgiving. Clouds clung to their peaks as though afraid to let go, and lightning often danced along their edges, illuminating the world in brief, violent flashes. The air there was thin, sharp with cold, and carried the scent of ash and ancient fire. It was a land shaped by dragons. Their shadows passed over the valleys like living storms. Their roars echoed through caverns older than kingdoms. Their hordes, glittering mountains of gold, jewels, and relics stolen from forgotten empires, lay hidden deep within the stone. Dragons, as all knew, valued wealth. They measured power in treasure, prestige in the brilliance of their hoards, and legacy in what they guarded. Gold was not merely metal, it was identity. Jewels were not decoration, they were proof of dominance. To be a dragon was to possess. But Calith was different. In a narrow cave carved high into a cliffside, hidden behind a jagged overhang of blackened rock, lived a dragon hatchling who defied every expectation of his kind. Calith was small by dragon standards. His scales shimmered faintly like embers beneath ash, dark gray edged with flickers of dull crimson. His wings, though still growing, stretched wide enough to catch the mountain winds, and his eyes glowed a soft, molten gold that seemed too gentle for a creature born of flame. And his hoard. His hoard was a single object. It lay at the center of his cave, resting on a carefully smoothed patch of stone, surrounded by small arrangements of pebbles and bones as if they were offerings. It was positioned with precision, as though its placement mattered more than anything else in the world. A toy plane. Its once bright paint had faded into dull streaks of red and white, scratched and worn by time. One wing bent slightly downward as though tired. The tiny propeller at its nose hung crooked, barely attached, and its body bore faint cracks that ran like scars across its surface. It was small, fragile, worthless. At least to any dragon. But to Calith, it was everything. He watched it constantly. Even now, curled protectively around it, his long tail wrapped like a barrier, Calith's gaze never strayed far from the fragile object. His breathing was slow and steady, sending small puffs of warm air across the stone floor, but his attention remained fixed. As if the plane might disappear the moment he looked away. Outside, the wind howled, scraping against the cliffside, whispering through cracks in the stone. The mountain spoke in its usual voice, restless, ancient, unyielding. Calith ignored it. His world was smaller than that. His world was the plane. He remembered the day he found it. Though dragons did not measure time the way humans did, the memory remained sharp, untouched by the slow erosion that dulled most experiences. It had carved itself into him, as surely as the storms carved the mountains. He had been younger then, smaller, less certain of himself. He had wandered farther than he should have, down the slopes where the mountains softened into hills, and the scent of humans lingered faintly in the air. It was a dangerous boundary, one the older dragons warned him against. Humans were unpredictable. They feared dragons, yes, but fear could make creatures reckless, dangerous. Some hunted dragons for glory, others for survival, and a few simply because they could. Calith had not understood that fully. He had only been curious. The world beyond the mountains felt different. The air was warmer, softer, carrying scents unfamiliar to him, smoke, metal, something sweet and fleeting. And then he saw it. Half buried in snow near the edge of a frozen clearing, lay something that did not belong. At first, he thought it was broken debris, perhaps from one of the strange human constructions he had glimpsed from afar. But as he approached, something stirred within him. A feeling. Not hunger, not fear. Something else. He nudged it gently with his snout, brushing away the thin layer of snow that covered it. Beneath the frost, color emerged, faded but still present. Red. White. Smooth surfaces unlike stone or bone. He tilted his head. It was shaped strangely, long and narrow, with two wings extending from its sides. It reminded him vaguely of the birds that sometimes dared to fly near the mountains, but it was not alive. And yet, it smelled of something. Smoke, yes, but not the harsh, choking smoke of dragonfire. This was different, softer, lingering. And beneath it, something warmer. Something that made his chest tighten in a way he did not understand. Carefully, he picked it up in his jaws. It was light, fragile, it did not resist. And in that moment, Calith made a decision he did not fully comprehend. He took it home. The older dragons noticed. Of course they did. Nothing unusual remained hidden for long in the Ashen Mountains. At first, they were merely curious. A hatchling returning from the lower slopes was not uncommon, but what he carried. That drew attention. What is that? One dragon had asked, her massive form coiled around a hoard of shimmering emeralds. Caliph did not answer. He simply tightened his grip and continued toward his cave. It smells of humans, another observed, smoke curling from his nostrils. You bring their scraps into our domain. Still, Caliph said nothing. He did not have the words to explain. Eventually, word reached Vorthrax. The ancient worm did not often involve himself in the affairs of younger dragons. His concerns lay elsewhere, his territory, his horde, his dominance over the mountains. But curiosity, even for one as old as he, could not be ignored forever. Caliph felt his presence before he saw him. The air grew heavier, warmer. The wind itself seemed to hesitate. Then came the shadow. Vorthrax descended from the sky like a falling star, his vast wings blotting out the sun, his scales glinting like molten gold. When he landed, the mountain trembled. Caliph stood at the entrance of his cave, the toy plane clutched carefully in his claws. Vorthrax's gaze settled on him, then slowly shifted. To that, the ancient dragon said. Caliph did not move. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant howl of wind. Then Vorthrax stepped closer. Each movement was deliberate, heavy with power. He lowered his massive head, studying the object in Caliph's grasp. A toy, he said at last. The word dripped with disdain. Caliph's claws tightened. It is broken, worthless, a thing made by creatures who burn quickly and leave nothing behind. Vorthrax's eyes narrowed, and you guard it. Caliph did not look away. Why? The question hung in the air, heavier than any threat. Caliph opened his mouth, then closed it. He did not know. Not truly. He only knew that the thought of losing it made something inside him twist, sharp and unbearable. Vorthrax's gaze hardened. A dragon's worth is measured by what it claims, he said. Gold, jewels, relics of power, not scraps. He straightened, his wings shifting slightly. Your hoard is an insult. The words struck harder than any physical blow. Caliph felt them, felt the weight of them settle over him. But still, he did not let go. Instead, he curled slightly inward, shielding the plane with his body. Vorthrax watched him for a long moment. Then, with a low rumble of something that might have been amusement or disappointment, he turned away. Perhaps you will learn, he said as he spread his wings. And then he was gone. The mountains did not change. The storm still came, the wind still howled. The older dragons still guarded their hoards, their caves glittering with wealth that reflected firelight in dazzling brilliance. But Caliph remained apart. He did not seek gold. He did not gather jewels. He did not hunt for relics or treasures. Instead, he spent his days in his cave, carefully arranging the small space around the plane. He smoothed the stone beneath it, removing any sharp edges that might scratch it. He brought small, smooth pebbles to place around it, not as treasure but as protection. Sometimes he simply watched it. Other times he would gently nudge it, adjusting its position by fractions, as though seeking the perfect alignment. At night he curled around it, his wings forming a barrier against the cold. And when other creatures wandered too close, he drove them away. Not with the full fury of a dragon, but with enough warning to make his meaning clear. The plane was not to be touched. It was his. Seasons passed. Snow fell, melted, and fell again. Caliph grew. His wings strengthened, his fire burned hotter. His presence, though still small compared to the ancient dragons, began to carry weight. But one thing did not change. The plane. It remained fragile. Time etched itself into it slowly. The paint faded further, small cracks deepened, the propeller loosened just a little more with each passing storm. Caliph noticed. Of course he did. He tried to be careful. He handled it less, watched it more. But he could not stop time. And somewhere deep within him, a quiet fear began to grow. What if it broke? The storm came without warning. The sky darkened faster than usual, clouds gathering in thick, heavy masses that swallowed the light. The wind shifted, growing sharper, more erratic. Kalis felt it before it arrived. The air tasted wrong. Then the thunder began. It rolled across the mountains in deep, violent waves, shaking the stone itself. Lightning followed, splitting the sky in jagged lines of white fire. The storm was not like the others. It was stronger, angrier. Calith retreated into his cave, his wings folding tightly against his body. The entrance, though partially shielded, did little to keep out the sound. Wind howled through the gaps, carrying dust and small debris with it. The cave trembled. Small stones fell from the ceiling, clattering against the floor. Calith moved closer to the center, closer to the plane. He curled around it, shielding it with his body, his tail wrapping tightly, his wings forming a barrier. It will pass, he told himself. Storms always did. But this one did not feel like it wanted to pass. A sudden crack split the air, louder than any before. And then, impact. The cliffside shuddered violently as lightning struck nearby. The force sent a shockwave through the stone, and part of the cave's ceiling gave way. Rocks fell. Calith reacted instantly, shifting his body to protect the center of the cave. Stones struck his back, his wings, his sides, but he held his position. The ground shook, and then stillness. The storm did not end, but the worst of it had passed. Slowly, carefully, Calith lifted his head. Dust filled the air, drifting in thin gray clouds. The cave was changed. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, leaving a jagged opening through which the stormlight flickered. Stones littered the floor, some large enough to crush bone. Calith moved cautiously, ensuring the immediate danger had passed. Then, he froze. The plane was no longer where it had been. His heart lurched, and he turned sharply, scanning the cave. There, near the edge of the stone platform, partially buried beneath a small pile of debris, lay the plane. Calith rushed forward, his movements suddenly frantic. Careful, careful. He pushed the stones aside, his claws trembling despite their strength. And then he saw it. The plane lay in two pieces. The break was clean but devastating. The body had split near the center, separating the wings from the tail. The propeller had come loose entirely, lying a short distance away. For a moment, Calith did not move. The world seemed to narrow, sound fading, the storm outside becoming distant, irrelevant. He stared. No, no. Carefully, so carefully, he lowered his head, nudging the pieces together. They did not fit. He tried again, adjusting the angle, pressing them closer. They slid apart. Again, and again. Each attempt slower than the last. Each failure heavier. A sound escaped him then, low, broken. Not a roar. Not a growl. Something smaller. Something wounded. He lowered himself to the ground, curling slightly around the pieces, as if proximity alone might fix them. But they remained separate. Unyielding. Broken. Calith did not understand. He had protected it. He had been careful. He had done everything right. And still it had broken. His claws hovered over the pieces, uncertain, afraid to touch them, afraid to make it worse. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cave, there was only silence. And for the first time since he had found the strange, fragile object in the snow, Calith felt something he had never known before. Not fear, not anger, not hunger, but something deeper, something heavier, something that settled into his chest and refused to leave. Helplessness. The human who did runs. Days passed. In the Ashen Mountains, time rarely held meaning. Storms came and went, shadows shifted across stone, and the wind sang its endless, restless song. Dragons marked their existence not by days, but by conquest, by growth, by the slow accumulation of power. But for Calith, time had become something else entirely. It had become still. He no longer flew. He no longer hunted. He no longer climbed the jagged ridges to feel the wind beneath his wings or chased the thermal currents that rose from the valleys below. The sky, once vast and inviting, might as well not have existed at all. His world had narrowed, shrunk, collapsed inward until it contained only one thing. The broken plains. It lay at the center of his cave, exactly where it had fallen after the storm. Caliph had cleared away the debris, smoothing the stone once more, restoring the small space to the way it had been. But the plane was no longer whole. Two pieces. Always two pieces. No matter how many times he tried, no matter how carefully he aligned them, they would not stay together. They slipped apart, stubborn and final, refusing to become what they once were. At first, Caliph had not accepted it. He had tried again, and again, and again, each attempt more careful than the last. Each failure quieter. Now he no longer tried. He simply watched. Curled around the pieces, his wings forming a loose barrier, Caliph lay with his head resting on the cold stone. His golden eyes remained fixed on the broken plane, unblinking, unmoving. His breathing was shallow, slow. There was no hunger in him. Or rather there was, but it no longer mattered. The ache in his stomach had long since faded into something dull and distant, overshadowed by a deeper, heavier feeling that refused to loosen its grip. Helplessness. The word had no shape in his mind, no language to define it, but he felt it all the same. It lived in the space between the two broken halves. It lingered in the silence of his cave. It pressed against his chest, heavy and unyielding. He had protected it. He had guarded it. He had done everything he could. And still it had broken. Outside, the mountains carried on. A pair of dragons circled high above, their roars echoing faintly as they clashed over territory. Somewhere distant, rock shifted and fell, the sound rolling through the valleys like thunder. Life continued, but Caliph remained apart from it. He ignored the distant calls of other dragons. He did not answer their challenges, did not respond to their presence. Even Vorthrax's shadow had passed once or twice across the mountain, vast and unmistakable, but Caliph did not leave his cave. He did not care. Nothing beyond the broken plain seemed real anymore. The scent came on the wind. Faint at first, subtle, different. Caliph's nostrils flared. His body tensed instantly, muscles tightening beneath his scales as his head lifted from the stone. The scent carried something sharp, metal oil smoke, but beneath it. Something else. Something familiar. Something that did not belong in the mountains. Humans. The word rose instinctively, carried by memory rather than thought. Caliph's eyes sharpened, the soft gold shifting into something brighter, more intense. Humans did not come here. Not willingly. The Ashen Mountains were not a place for fragile creatures of flesh and bone. The cold alone would break them, the terrain would tear them apart, and if the mountains did not claim them, the dragons would. Caliph rose slowly, unfolding his wings slightly as he turned toward the cave entrance. The wind shifted again. Stronger now. The scent was fresh. Close. His claws pressed into the stone. Most dragons would have reacted without hesitation. An intruder, especially a human, was a threat. Threats were eliminated. It was simple, efficient, natural. Caliph took a step forward, then stopped. The broken plane lay behind him. He could feel it, even without looking. Something in him resisted. Not the instinct to defend, no, that remained, but something else quieter, more uncertain. He did not want to leave it. He did not want to abandon it, even for a moment. The scent grew stronger. Closer. Caliph's gaze shifted back toward the cave entrance. The wind carried the sound now. Footsteps. Unsteady. Dragging slightly. The human was struggling. Caliph exhaled slowly, a thin stream of heat curling from his nostrils. Then with deliberate care he stepped aside. Not away, but to the side, leaving the center of the cave visible. Exposed. The broken plane lay there unguarded. For the first time since it had broken, Caliph did not cover it. The human appeared at the entrance moments later. He stumbled more than stepped, catching himself against the jagged stone as he crossed into the cave. His movements were slow, unsteady, as though each step required effort. He was small. Smaller than Caliph had expected. Wrapped in heavy, worn clothing that hung unevenly from his frame, dusted with snow and ash. A satchel hung from one shoulder, its leather cracked and weathered, the strap frayed in places. There was no weapon in his hands. No armors. No sign of the tools humans used to fight dragons. Only exhaustion. And cold. His breath came in visible bursts, sharp and uneven, his body trembling as he stepped fully into the cave. Then he looked up and saw the dragon. Everything stopped. The human froze where he stood, his entire body going rigid, his breath catching mid-exhale. Calith did not move. They stared at each other. For a long moment, neither of them breathed. The human's eyes widened, fear flooding into them instantly, raw and undeniable. His hands tightened reflexively, though he held nothing. His body shifted slightly as though preparing to run. But there was nowhere to go. Behind him lay the storm. Before him, a dragon. Calith watched him, studied him. This was what humans were then. Small, fragile, easily broken, and yet dangerous. He could feel it, the potential for harm, hidden behind fear and instinct. The stories the older dragons told were not wrong. Humans could kill. Humans could destroy. Humans could take. Calith's gaze hardened slightly. He should drive him out. Or worse, that was what dragons did. That was what was expected. But then, the human's gaze shifted. Downward, toward the center of the cave. Toward the broken plains. His expression changed. Confusion replaced fear, if only for a moment. Calith noticed, and without fully understanding why, he stepped aside, just slightly, clearing the view. The broken plane lay fully visible now, the two pieces resting apart on the stone. The human blinked. "You want me to see that?" His voice was quiet, uncertain. Calith lowered his head slowly, his posture shifting, not into an attack, not into dominance, but something else. Something smaller, softer. A low sound escaped his throat. Not a growl, not a warning. Something closer to a rumble. A question, a plea. The human stared at him. The fear did not disappear, but it changed. Shifted. Something else crept in. Understanding. Slowly, cautiously, the human took a step forward. Every movement was careful, deliberate, as though he expected the dragon to strike at any moment. Calith did not move. He watched, waited. The human took another step, and another, until he stood near the center of the cave, the broken plane just before him. He hesitated, then knelt. His hands trembled as he reached out, pausing just before touching the object, as though seeking permission. Calith did not stop him. Carefully, gently, the human picked up one of the pieces. His fingers traced the edge of the break, his brow furrowing slightly. "It's just a model plane," he murmured. Then he paused. His gaze flicked briefly toward the dragon. Then back to the planes. "No," he corrected softly, "not just." There was something in his voice. Recognition. Understanding. "Not to you." Calith's eyes did not leave him. The tension in his body remained, but it shifted just slightly. Less sharp. Less immediate. The human reached for the second piece, lifting it just as carefully. He turned them both in his hands, examining them closely. The cracks. The bends. The damage. He exhaled slowly. "This won't be easy," he said, more to himself than to the dragon. Calith leaned closer. The human stiffened but did not pull away. Warm breath brushed against his hands, carrying the faint scent of smoke. The dragon was watching. Closely. Waiting. The human swallowed. Then slowly he shifted the satchel from his shoulder, placing it carefully on the ground beside him. "You're trusting me," he said quietly. It was not a question. Calith did not respond. But he did not move away. The human nodded slightly. "All right." He opened the satchel. Inside lay a collection of tools, small, precise, carefully organized. Tiny hammers, thin wires, small containers of adhesive, clamps no larger than his fingers. Tools not for fighting, but for building, for fixing, for creating. He selected them one by one, laying them out on the stone. Calith watched every movement. Every shift of the human's hands, every tool, every motion, ready. If the human did anything wrong, anything that threatened the plane, he would act. But the human's movements were careful, deliberate, respectful. He began with the frame, aligning the broken edges with meticulous precision. His fingers worked slowly, adjusting angles, testing the fit. Stay, he murmured, though whether he meant the pieces or himself was unclear. He applied a thin layer of adhesive along the crack, pressing the two halves together gently, holding them in place. Time passed. Slowly, quietly. The storm outside faded, its fury replaced by distant rumbling. Inside the cave, only the soft sounds of careful work remained. Metal against metal. Cloth against stone. Breath. Calith did not move. He did not blink. He watched. The human worked, reinforcing the joint with thin strips of wire, bending them carefully, securing them in place, straightening the bent wing, adjusting it millimeter by millimeter until it aligned properly. Almost done, he whispered. Hours passed. Light shifted at the cave entrance, the gray of storm giving way to the pale glow of early dawn. Finally, the human leaned back. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the plane. Whole, repaired. Not perfect, the cracks were still visible, the surface still worn, but it was whole. He turned it slightly, examining his work. Then held it out. There. Calith stared. His eyes widened slightly, the molten gold catching the faint light. He stepped closer, his movements cautious, almost hesitant. The plane was whole. Not broken. Not in pieces. Whole. He lowered his head, bringing his gaze level with it, studying every detail. The lines, the shape, the form. It was as it had been. Almost. Something was missing. He could feel it, even if he could not name it. The human saw it. Of course he did. He had seen the way the dragon watched the object. Not just as something to possess, but as something to understand. It doesn't fly, the human said quietly. The words settled heavily in the air. Calith's gaze dropped slightly. The faint spark of something hope perhaps dimmed. The plane was whole, but it was still. Still, the human hesitated. He looked at the planes, then at the dragons, then back again. A thought formed. Slowly, carefully, then unexpectedly. He smiled. Not widely, not boldly, but enough. Not yet. Calith looked up. Something shifted. Just slightly. Not understanding, but something close. Something new. And for the first time since the plane had broken, the weight in his chest eased. Just a little. When dragons learned to fly again, dawn came quietly to the Ashen Mountains. After days of storm and restless winds, the sky finally stilled. The heavy clouds that had long clung to the jagged peaks began to thin, breaking apart into soft streaks of pale gray and fatting silver. Light, gentle, hesitant, crept across the horizon, spilling slowly over the world below. For a brief moment, the mountains did not roar. They breathed. The cold air remained sharp, but it carried something new with it, a stillness that felt almost fragile, as though the world itself was pausing, waiting. At the edge of a narrow cliff, high above the valleys below, a human stood alone. Zarin. His figure looked impossibly small against the vastness of the mountains. The wind tugged at his worn cloak, pulling at its edges, whispering around him as though testing his resolve. His boots stood at the very edge of the stone, toes just inches from the drop where the mountain fell away into open sky. In his hands, he held something carefully. Gently. The plane. It was no longer broken. No longer just a fragile relic found in snow. It had been changed. Through the long, quiet hours of the night, while the world slept and the mountains whispered, Aaron had worked. The dim glow of embers from Calith's breath had lit his hands as he shaped, adjusted, and rebuilt the small object. He had not tried to restore it to what it once was. Instead, he had given it something new. Thin, carefully balanced weights now rested within its body, hidden beneath its worn exterior. The wings had been reshaped subtly, precisely, to catch the wind rather than resist it. The fragile joints had been reinforced, strengthened without adding weight. And most importantly, it had been given purpose, not as a toy, but as something that could answer the sky. Behind him, claws scraped softly against stone. Calith shifted. The dragon stood several paces back from the edge, his wings half unfurled, his tail twitching restlessly. His golden eyes were fixed on the object in Aaron's hands, unblinking intense. There was tension in him. Not the sharp, aggressive tension of a predator ready to strike, but something more uncertain. Something fragile. Hope and fear. They warred within him, unseen but undeniable. Aaron felt it. He did not need to look back to know. His grip on the plane tightened slightly. For a moment he hesitated. Not because he doubted his work, but because he understood what this meant. This was not just an experiment. Not just a demonstration. This was something far greater. For the dragon behind him, this was everything. If it failed, Aaron exhaled slowly. No, he would not think that way. He had done what he could. Now the sky would decide. Trust me, he said quietly. The words were carried by the wind, soft but steady. Behind him, Calith stilled. The scraping of claws ceased. The restless movement stopped. Silence fell. Trust. It was not a concept dragons embraced easily. Their world was built on strength, on dominance, on control. To trust another, especially something as fragile as a human, was to surrender something essential. And yet, Calith did not move, did not turn away. He watched, and he trusted. Aaron stepped closer to the edge. The drop beyond stretched endlessly, the valley far below painted in shadows and soft morning light. The wind rose from below, steady and strong, carrying with it the warmth of the rising sun. Perfect. Aaron adjusted his grip on the plane, holding it lightly now, feeling its balance. It felt right. Not perfect, but right. He raised it slightly, testing the air. The wind pressed against its wings, catching the subtle angles he had carved, lifting it just enough for him to feel the resistance. Good. Behind him, Calith took a small step forward. A low sound escaped his throat, not quite a growl, not quite a question. Aaron smiled faintly. I know, he murmured. Then, he took a breath. And through it, the world seemed to hold its breath. The plane left Aaron's hand moving forward, carried by the force of the throw. And then, it dropped. Just slightly. A single sharp dip. Behind him, Calith lunged forward with a sudden, instinctive roar, his wings snapping open as though to chase, to catch, to save. But he stopped. Because the plane did not fall. It caught. The wind shifted beneath it, lifting it, cradling it, carrying it upward in a smooth, graceful arc. The wings tilted slightly, adjusting to the current, stabilizing. And then, it soared. Not wildly, not erratically, but with quiet, deliberate motion. It glided. The small, fragile object moved through the air as though it belonged there, as though it had always belonged there. It rode the currents, dipping slightly before rising again, catching the invisible pathways that only wings, or something like them, could follow. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The mountains fell silent. The wind softened. The world narrowed to a single, impossible sight. A broken thing. Flying. Calith did not move. He stood at the edge of the cliff, his massive form utterly still, his golden eyes wide and bright, reflecting the tiny shape gliding through the air before him. Something inside him shifted. The weight that had pressed against his chest for so long, the heaviness, the silence, the helplessness. It cracked. Light seeped through. The plane dipped again, catching another current, turning slightly as it followed the flow of air along the cliffside. Alive, not in the way creatures were alive, but in its own way. It moved. It answered the sky. A sound rose from Calith's chest. Soft, unsteady. It was not a roar. Not a growl. It was something else. Something lighter. Something brighter. Wonder. He leapt. The movement was sudden, powerful, instinctive. One moment he stood upon the cliff. The next he was gone. Aaron's breath caught sharply as the dragon launched himself into open air, his massive form dropping fast, wings still folded tight against his body. For a split second, it looked like he was falling. Then, his wings spread. Wide, vast. They caught the wind with a deep, resonant force, the air itself seeming to bend around them as he pulled upward, his descent transforming into motion, into flight. Aaron exhaled slowly, his heart racing. Below him, Calith moved. Not with the sharp, aggressive power of a dragon in battle, but with something different. Something careful. He angled his body, adjusting his wings, following the path of the plane. Not chasing. Not hunting. Following. The plane dipped. Calith dipped with it. The plane rose. Calith rose. He circled it once, his massive form moving with surprising precision, his wings cutting through the air with controlled, deliberate strokes. He was not trying to catch it. He was trying to stay with it. To understand it. The plane shifted again, caught in a rising current, lifting higher. Calith followed. Their movements began to align. Dragon and machine. Instinct and design. Two entirely different things. Moving as one. From the cliff, Aaron watched. And for the first time since he had entered the mountains. He left. It was quiet. Soft. But it carried something real. Something warm. Below, the dragon and the plane moved together, their paths weaving through the morning air, carving invisible patterns into the sky. Calith's movements grew more confident. More fluid. He began to anticipate the currents, adjusting his wings before the plane shifted, guiding himself into position. And sometimes, very gently, he guided the plane as well. A subtle shift of air. A careful adjustment of position. Not controlling it, but helping it, keeping it aloft, keeping it safe, as it had always been. Only now, he did not have to hold it still. Now, he could let it fly. Time passed. Minutes, or perhaps longer. It was difficult to tell. Eventually, the currents began to weaken, the steady flow of air softening as the morning settled. The plane dipped lower. Slower, its path became less certain. Calith noticed. Of course he did. He adjusted his flight, moving closer, his wings angling to create a gentle push of air beneath the small object, keeping it aloft just a little longer. But even he could not hold it forever. The plane began to descend. Gradually, gently, Calith followed. Closer now. Careful. Precise. As the ground approached, he extended one claw, slow and deliberate, matching the plane's descent. Closer. Closer. And then, he caught it. Not with forces. Not with speed. But with care. The plane settled into his grasp as though it belonged there. Safe. Whole. Still. But no longer broken. Calith rose once more, his wings carrying him upward in a slow, steady arc as he returned to the cliff. Aaron stepped back slightly as the dragon approached, the rush of air from his wings stirring the dust and loose stone. Calith landed with surprising gentleness, his massive form settling onto the rock with a soft, controlled impact. For a moment, neither moved. Then Calith lowered his head. Slowly, carefully, the plane rested in his claws. Intact, unbroken, and something more. Alive in its own way. Aaron looked at him. At the dragons. At the creature who had once seemed like nothing more than a force of nature, something distant and untouchable. Now, he looked different. Not smaller. Not weaker. But changed. Calith extended his claw slightly, offering the plane. Aaron hesitated. Then stepped forward. Slowly, his hand reached out, stopping just short of the dragon's scales. He could feel the heat radiating from them, the steady, powerful warmth of a creature born of fire. For a moment, he paused. Then, he touched him, just lightly, his hand resting against the smooth, warm surface of Calith's scales. The dragon did not pull away, did not flinch. He remained still, accepting, The contact was brief, but it was enough. High above the Ashen Mountains, the sky stretched wide and open, painted in soft hues of gold and pale blue. The world had not changed. The mountains were still jagged. The storms would return. The dragons would continue to guard their hoards of gold and jewels, measuring their worth in things that could be counted. But something new had been added to the world. Something small, something fragile, something that could not be measured in gold. In the cave high above the valley, Calith's hoard remained. But it was no longer just an object. It was not just something to protect. It was something that could move, that could soar, that could become more than it was. And Calith, he was no longer the dragon who guarded a broken thing. He was the dragon who let it fly. In time, the other dragons would notice. They would see the strange sight in the skies, a dragon circling something small, something unnatural, something that glided without wings. They would question. They would mock. They would not understand. But some would watch more closely. And perhaps in time, they would begin to wonder if there was more to a hoard than gold, more to power than possession, more to strength than holding on. And far below, in the valleys and villages at the edge of the mountains, stories would begin to spread. Whispers at first, then tales of a dragon who did not burn, of a creature of fire who flew beside something small and delicate, guiding it through the sky like a guardian rather than a destroyer, and of a human who did not run. In the end, the legend that grew was not one of destruction, not of fear, not of fire, but of something far rarer. A bond between two creatures who should never have trusted one another. Between instinct and invention. Between strength and fragility. And in that bond, something new was born. Not gold, not jewels, but something far more precious. Hope.